The year 1900 was not only the beginning of a new century, but also a special moment in American history, where the past and the future merged and blended together. This was a period when American society began to face major technological, social, and political changes. The country still bore many of the marks of the 19th century, but at the same time witnessed decisive steps to enter the 20th century. A century of profound change. With the emergence of new industries, inventions, and values, the United States in 1900 seemed to be at an important crossroads. On one side, the traditional values, habits, and social structures of the 19th century were still firmly in place, while on the other side, an explosion of creativity and innovation was pushing the country into a modern era, full of potential but also full of challenges. One of the interesting features of this period is the interplay between the old and the new. Although America had become an industrial power, this development had not completely destroyed the backward social structures. The clear class division still existed, and problems such as racism, poverty, and harsh working conditions still blighted the American social landscape. In particular, when we look back, we realize that the year 1900 was not only the birth of the Industrial Revolution but also the beginning of global changes. Inventions such as the automobile, the airplane, the telephone, and the cinema changed the way people lived and worked. But more importantly, there were changes in thinking, approaches to technology, economics, and society. This was also a period of confrontation between old and new values. Many still hold on to their faith in old values, but many also recognize that in order for the country to develop, it needs to change, not just technologically but socially as well. Social organizations, reform movements, and progressive leaders have begun to fight for a more equitable society, where everyone has the opportunity to improve their lives, regardless of their social class. The 20th century began with a major shift in everything from science, technology, culture, and especially in the way American society viewed traditional values. While some people still held on to classical values, a large segment of the population began to seek innovation, creativity, and experimentation. They saw the future not as a place to preserve old things, but as a place to grow, explore, and reach new heights. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the influence of old theories remained strong. Isaac Newton's theories were still the foundation for science, and society was still strongly influenced by royal values, such as the veneration of Queen Victoria, a symbol of the strong and secure British Empire. However, within this society, the development of technology, especially the inventions of Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell and Henry Ford, opened a new era, where old values gradually gave way to new concepts and opportunities. Along with the development of industries, innovation in thinking was equally important. Many thinkers, scientists and politicians began to think that society needed to change to keep up with the pace of development of the times. One of the major problems facing society at that time was class division. The rich and big companies were gaining more and more power, while the working class and the poor had no voice and rights in society. This development not only brought opportunities, but also raised big questions about social justice. Could the development of industry and the rise of the wealthy class blur this division? Could poor workers have a better life in an increasingly modern and industrialized society? These questions became an important part of the discussion about the future of the United States, and some of the answers to them would be offered throughout the 20th century. While the absence of technology that we take for granted today is easily noticeable in 1900, this was also a time when inventions made major breakthroughs. Although there was no internet or mobile phones, the world in 1900 was not short of inventions that made life much easier than before. The Industrial Revolution changed everything from mass production to infrastructure. One of the great inventions of this period was the automobile. Initially, cars were just a luxury item for the upper class, but the emergence of mass production initiated by Henry Ford made cars a popular means of transportation. Not only did cars change the way people move, they also became a symbol of freedom and personal progress. Along with cars, electric lighting was also one of the important inventions. Thomas Edison, with his invention, brought electric light into every house, turning night into day and extending people's working and living hours. This not only helped to extend the working day but also brought a sense of comfort unprecedented in human history. Despite its rapid industrialization and growth, the United States still faced a divide between rich and poor. The wealthy elite controlled the economy, while the working class struggled with poverty and hardship. Opportunities for improvement were limited, especially for the people of the South, where slavery and the aftermath of the American Civil War were still deeply ingrained. The Southern system of sharecropping was a prime example of social injustice. Farmers, whether white or black, lived in poverty, with no chance of escaping the vicious cycle of debt and hard labor for the landowners. This was a form of modern-day slavery, where workers could not own land or improve their living conditions. The Industrial Revolution ushered in a new era in the United States. With cities becoming more modern and bustling, the rapid growth of industry created a large number of jobs. But at the same time, it also caused a clear social division. Factories, large companies, and great construction projects brought rapid changes to the economy and people's lives. With the emergence of industrial cities, workers had to live in extremely difficult conditions. Work in factories was often very hard and dangerous, and workers had little voice in society. This gave rise to reform movements, aiming to protect workers' rights and create a more equitable society. The Industrial Revolution ushered in a new era in the United States. With cities becoming more modern and bustling, the rapid growth of industry created a large number of jobs. But at the same time, it also caused a clear social division. Factories, large companies, and great construction projects brought rapid changes to the economy and people's lives. With the emergence of industrial cities, workers had to live in extremely difficult conditions. Work in factories was often very hard and dangerous, and workers had little voice in society. This gave rise to reform movements, aiming to protect workers' rights and create a more equitable society in 1900. Cars were a new, luxurious concept and almost exclusively for the wealthy. However, the biggest change in the industry was the advent of mass production. The advent of Henry Ford with his assembly line production methods completely changed the way cars were made. Before Ford applied mass production, cars were handmade, expensive and only available to the wealthy few. But when Ford started producing cars on the assembly line, production costs dropped dramatically, making cars an accessible means of transportation for ordinary people. Ford not only produced cars but also changed the foundation of American society. By cutting costs and increasing productivity, he made it possible for working-class families to own their first cars. This not only changed transportation but also created a shift in thinking. The automobile became a symbol of freedom, a means of not only helping people move but also reflecting the changes in society. When people could own cars, they were no longer limited by geographical distance and no longer lived in isolated rural areas, but instead could move between cities and develop work, communication and society. The development of the automobile also created a new need for infrastructure. Roads, bridges and public transportation systems began to be more focused than ever. Cities also began to emerge as new residential areas, where people could move easily thanks to cars. Wide highways were built, and urban areas began to develop more strongly, contributing to the formation of new residential areas, along with the development of the automobile. Supporting industries such as oil production, auto parts, gasoline, vehicle maintenance, and related service industries all flourished. This not only created jobs but also boosted the economy, creating a foundation for American industry. In fact, the automobile was not just a means of transportation but also a tool for social change. The ability of people to own a car improved their quality of life, allowing them to participate in more social, recreational and family activities. The car became an indispensable part of every family's life. The life of a worker in the early 20th century in the United States was a grim and harsh picture. Although the country was entering an era of strong industrialization, the working conditions of workers were extremely bad. Large factories such as those in New York, Chicago or Detroit attracted millions of workers looking for work, but in return they had to live in extremely difficult conditions. One of the biggest problems facing workers was long working hours, no days off, and low wages. Workers often had to work 12 to 16 hours a day. 6 days a week, with wages that were not enough to cover their living expenses. This left them with almost no time to rest, no opportunity to learn or improve their lives. In addition to harsh working conditions, workers also faced a lack of social protection. While the wealthy and industrialists profited from the country's growth, workers lived in poverty, deprivation, and lack of rights. Labor organizations, when they existed, were often illegal and were severely suppressed. Workers who organized strikes to demand their rights were treated harshly, often shot or arrested. In this context, social movements began to flourish. The labor reform movement became one of the most powerful forces in the fight for workers' rights. Leaders such as Samuel Gompers and Eugene V. Debs began to fight for workers' rights, demanding higher wages, shorter hours, and improved working conditions. One of the most important issues facing workers was the child labor system. By 1900, 1/4 of children between the ages of 12 and 16 were working in factories, mines, or farms instead of going to school. They work in extremely poor conditions, sometimes in toxic and dangerous environments, without health insurance or occupational safety. This not only affects their health but also robs them of the opportunity to learn and develop. Social reform organizations have begun to act to protect the rights of children, fighting to get children back to school instead of forcing them to work hard from a young age. Several organizations and movements, such as the National Child Labor Committee, have been established to advocate and seek to end child labor. However, this fight has dragged on for decades before significant changes in law and policy have been made. Although slavery was officially abolished in the United States in 1865, African Americans still faced a severe system of racial discrimination and lack of basic civil rights. African American life, especially in the South, was still governed by harsh Jim Crow laws, where blacks were discriminated against in everything from education, public transportation, to voting rights. In 1896, the Plessy v. Ferguson case legalized the policy of separate but equal, allowing for widespread legal segregation across the country. Whites only signs appeared everywhere, in schools, hospitals, restaurants, parks, and even public transportation. This left blacks living in a segregated society, without basic freedoms and under constant threat of violence. One of the most brutal manifestations of racism was lynching, where African Americans, especially men, were routinely executed without trial, simply because they were suspected or because of their race. During the late 19th century, more than 200 lynchings occurred each year in the South, most of which were unproven and without any intervention from the judicial system. However, despite the oppression and suffering, the black community continued to fight for its rights. Leaders such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois campaigned for a more just society. Booker T. Washington advocated that blacks should focus on education and economic development to improve their status in society, while W.E.B. Du Bois, however, believed that fighting for suffrage and civil rights was the only way to achieve equality. Along with the development of the labor movement and black nationalist interests, the social reform movement became an indispensable factor in American society in the early 20th century. Leaders such as President Theodore Roosevelt introduced strong reform policies, aiming to reduce the division between classes and protect the rights of workers. One of the most important areas that Roosevelt and the reformers focused on was dealing with the power of large industrial corporations. They realized that without government intervention, large corporations would continue to abuse their power to enrich themselves and increase inequality in society. Therefore, Roosevelt introduced anti-monopoly policies, banned corporate takeovers, and promoted regulations to protect consumers. In addition, muckrakers, journalists also played an important role in exposing serious problems in society. Investigative reporting by journalists such as Upton Sinclair exposed poor conditions in the food industry, especially Chicago meat processing plants, leading to the enactment of consumer protection laws. In the early 20th century, life in the United States was still dominated by simple but interesting forms of entertainment, reflecting the changing needs and lifestyles of the people. Although most of the people's time was spent on hard work, moments of relaxation and entertainment remained an important part of their lives. In particular, the emergence of movies, sports, and amusement parks created a new wave of fun and social interaction in the community. In a country where family time and outdoor recreation were important, people, especially in large cities, found joy in public entertainment. Before television or the internet, movies, sports matches, and amusement parks were the main forms of entertainment. The first films, although quite simple and only visible on small screens in cinemas, created a huge boom. The first film with a clear and easy-to-understand story, The Great Train Robbery, 1903, attracted millions of viewers, marking the beginning of a new entertainment industry. Cinema. Along with the development of the cinema industry, music also became an indispensable element in people's lives. Music genres such as jazz and ragtime began to flourish and develop strongly in the early 20th century. Although new, they quickly won the hearts of the public. Jazz in particular brought a new breeze to American music, with the combination of European musical elements and black musical styles. Along with the development of music genres, performances, concerts and musical events also became an important part of cultural life. One of the most notable events was the birth of amusement parks such as Coney Island in New York. It became a popular weekend destination for families, with games, Ferris wheels, roller coasters, and other exciting activities. With over 1 million electric lights illuminating the night, Coney Island provided a magical space where both adults and children could satisfy their need for entertainment and find joy in a stressful and tiring world. Although the development of technology and industry has brought many changes, the way Americans seek pleasure has not changed much compared to previous centuries. They continue to enjoy outdoor activities such as walking, cycling, participating in amateur sports, or simply spending time with family and friends. Afternoons in the park, folk games, and cheerful conversations are still an indispensable part of social life. In addition, reading, listening to music, and playing musical instruments are also popular activities. Although there are no modern means of entertainment such as television or the internet, people still find joy in books, especially famous literary works such as those of Mark Twain, H.G. Wells, and Charles Dickens. These works not only entertain but also provide lessons about life, philosophy of life, and worldview. The United States' journey into the world at the beginning of the 20th century was a slow but decisive process in which the country began to assert itself as an emerging power. One of the most important milestones in American foreign policy at this time was President McKinley's open-door policy. This policy was designed to ensure American commercial interests in accessing international markets, especially in China, where Western powers were seeking to dominate. Although this policy created many commercial opportunities for the United States, it also posed many risks, as the United States faced resistance from Asian and European countries that also had interests in the region. The open-door policy not only helped the United States develop its economy, but also reflected the country's ambition to expand its international influence. However, this policy was not always successful. As in the late 19th century, the United States began to intervene in regional wars and conflicts, clearly demonstrating the transformation of the United States from a conservative, isolationist country to a country involved in international affairs. The intervention in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War is a typical example of the contradiction in American foreign policy. Although the United States declared war on Spain to liberate its colonies, it was then faced with a Filipino uprising, which turned the United States into a neo-colonial. This war caused thousands of deaths and was an important milestone in showing the contradiction between the ideals of liberty and the policy of imperial expansion of the United States. In 1901, after President McKinley was assassinated, Theodore Roosevelt took over. With the emergence of Roosevelt, the United States began to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy. He strongly asserted America's power in international affairs and participated in wars and the affairs of other countries. Roosevelt also boldly declared, "Big words but bigger actions," demonstrating his ambition to expand America's influence in global affairs. Under Roosevelt's leadership, the United States began to engage in territorial expansion strategies, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. Roosevelt's "Big Stick" policy emphasized the use of military and political power to protect American interests and ensure stability in the region. The construction of the Panama Canal to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans was one of the symbolic works of America's ambition to strengthen its international position. In addition to increasing its military and political presence, the United States also began to focus on promoting global trade policies. Through its advocacy of free trade and international trade agreements, the United States expanded its influence not only in the Western Hemisphere but also in Asian and European countries. The open door policy continued to be maintained, allowing the United States to participate in important international dialogues and agreements. Although America's involvement in international affairs increased significantly in the early 20th century, the country still faced contradictions in its foreign policy. The relationship between the United States and other major powers continued to be challenging, especially when these countries had their own interests and did not easily accept American intervention in their affairs. Looking back at life in the United States in 1900, we can clearly see a country in the midst of profound technological, social, and political revolutions. Although entering the 20th century with many new opportunities, there were also many difficulties and conflicts to overcome. As a country with long-standing traditional values, the United States faced a tension between the old and the new. The old values remained strong, but strong waves of innovation gradually changed the face of society and the way people thought about the future. One of the most important things we can see from this period is the profound contradiction between technological development and equally serious social problems. While technological advances transformed the United States into a major industrial nation, with incredible inventions such as the automobile, electricity, and motion pictures, inequality, racism, and social inequalities continued to plague the United States. This was evident in aspects such as the harsh living conditions of workers, the brutality of the sharecropping system, and harsh segregation laws. However, this was also a time when the United States began to make great strides toward reform and change. The struggles for workers' rights, the African American civil rights movement, and the voices of progressive leaders paved the way for important changes in the decades that followed. Despite the hardships, far-reaching reforms emerged from these injustices, and social organizations began to have a strong influence in changing policies and lifestyles. The relationship between economic development and social life at this time also reflected a constant confrontation between progress and conservatism. Industrial tycoons, despite creating huge fortunes, faced criticism from those in society who called for greater equality. Workers, who were pushed into poor areas of the city, fought tirelessly in search of a better life. They contributed greatly to the development of the country, but paid the price with extremely harsh working conditions. This is proof that progress does not always come with equality. Especially in the context of a rapidly changing world, the United States not only faced internal challenges but also had to find ways to assert its position on the international stage. President McKinley's open-door policy helped promote the growth of international trade. But at the same time, American foreign policy faced the contradictions of maintaining freedom and independence, while also facing unwanted conflicts and wars. Despite a period of strong industrial development, the United States in 1900 was still not a perfect country where everyone enjoyed an equal and fair life. Wealth inequality, racial discrimination, and social injustice continued to be major problems that needed to be solved. However, it was in these challenges that the American people showed a spirit of resilience and continued to fight for their rights. Reforms, both small and large, opened a new path for American society. The struggles for labor rights, voting rights, and equal rights for women and blacks began to make a big impact. Social organizations, unions, and human rights organizations laid a solid foundation for future struggles. In particular, these struggles created an important premise for the powerful civil rights movements of the following decades. The year 1900 was a milestone in the long journey of the United States. The country not only faced great challenges but also found ways to overcome them. From an emerging industrial nation, the United States gradually became a global force, both economically powerful and politically and socially influential. However, the lessons of social justice, relentless progress, and fighting spirit would continue to be decisive factors in the formation of a more just and equal society. The important thing we can learn from this period is that while technological advancement can change the face of society, social problems, especially those related to equity and rights, cannot be solved by technological change alone. A truly developed country must be one where everyone has equal opportunity to advance. And this can only be achieved through continuous struggle and reform.